This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. James and John and the rest of the disciples, they just don't get it, do they? 3 times Jesus talks about the fact that he's going to be handed over to suffering and death and rise again on the 3rd day. 3 times he brings this up to his disciples. And each time they respond in a way that shows they don't get it. Okay. This time, after Jesus has said this, James and John rush up to him and say, "Well, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. We're the first ones, so we get to call." Somebody I was reading this week said, James and John call shotgun. Because, I mean, as a tradition-minded church like we are, the tradition of the first one who says shotgun gets the seat right next to the driver, right? So they were calling shotgun. And they were assuming that shotgun meant that they got to be the most trusted insiders. It meant they were planning on hitching their wagon to Jesus' star, right? Now, we know a little bit about that. If you look at politics across our country, whether it's one party or another, you can't go very far without looking for someone who's trying to figure out how to hitch their wagon to whatever seems like the brightest star that's coming along. For James and John, it was a sign that they really weren't listening. They were thinking that when Jesus has things his way, then if we're closest to him, it'll all go our way. And time and again, they thought that. But they weren't listening. Now, if you don't get this, you need to think a little bit about the context. Before these 3 times in a row that Jesus talks about what his future really looks like and what his life is really dedicated to, before he heals a blind man. And it takes time because the blind man doesn't get healed real quick, and it takes a couple applications of Jesus' prayer. And after this episode that we're reading, Jesus heals another blind man. So if you didn't get the message in between, blind to blind, the disciples just don't see it. The question is, do we see it? Are we ready to see what Jesus is trying so hard to tell his disciples? Well, my prayer is that we can. But I had the opportunity over the weekend to learn more about what Jesus was really all about. I happened to be in New Mexico, and Susan and I were back there to bury her mother. And the priest at Trinity on the Hill was in charge of the service. He did the sermon, and I was kind of helping out. And one of the things, when you're doing a service for somebody who doesn't go to church very much, sometimes that can be problematic. But we knew Barbara, and the priest had gotten to know some of her children, and so we had people get up and were speaking, and they were talking about a bunch of things. And they were things that I have known for some 38 years, but I'd never really connected all the dots. Here's some of the things they talked about. She was a member of the Lions Club in Los Alamos, and they collect glasses that are then moved on to provide glasses for people in poorer places who can't have access to them. Every Christmas, she was the bell ringer for the Salvation Army donations in Los Alamos, and it's cold there, and she had a windy spot that got all the wind. She catered all of their meetings, and ultimately when she stopped catering the meetings stopped. Just saying. There was a fella who stood up and said, I wanted to talk about the fact that we had a friend once who needed to get to Albuquerque for radiation treatments. And Barbara ended up giving him a ride, and out of that, she and some other folks started what they called the Help Group to help people in Los Alamos, give folks rides 30 miles or 100 miles to Albuquerque or Santa Fe when they needed it. And she coordinated it. She didn't give all the rides, but sometimes she did. If somebody couldn't show up, she'd drive to Albuquerque at the drop of a hat. Sometimes when we'd be at dinner, she'd have to plan dinner so that she had time to do her reading. Because they have a tiny little newspaper in Los Alamos, the Monitor, and every day, or every time they had an episode come out, she would read certain parts of the newspaper into a recording that was available for people in the area who were blind. And they could call in and listen to the newspaper. And she coordinated who read all the parts, plus she read some of them herself, and if somebody didn't show, so our dinners waited until she was done with her reading. She worked the Tourist Information Center. And then, when we were all done with the speakers, the sermon, everything else, a little lady got up who was the next door neighbor, and she was really, really tiny and even older than Barbara had been. And she got up and she said, one day Barbara was out washing her windows at the house. And considering how short my mother-in-law was, this was kind of an interesting thing for her to be out washing the windows. And Barbara looked over at my windows and she said, yours need to be washed too, don't they? So she came over and washed her windows as well. There's the gourmet food group, the wine tasting group, the church discussion group, and then there's Thelma and Louise. Her best friend, who was a little bit older than her, both of their husbands had died, so they decided that sometimes they just hit the road together. They did not like interstates, so they drove back highways and roads all across the United States, including one time when they ended up taking out a deer on a northern New Mexico highway. They both survived it, the deer didn't. And what we realized was, there was a fellow at the reception who came up to me, and we hadn't talked, but he said, yep, when I look at Barbara, I just think that's what Jesus meant by service. And I was kind of stunned, because we spent a lot of time thinking about how service is about church. And what I want to say is service is what happens if you learn the lessons of church. We're expected to go out and serve. Today is our ministry fair, and there are a lot of places here to serve. There are people here who bring other people to church because they don't have a ride. We have people here who are part of the cancer center, and they're there to check people in and to hold a hand and put an arm around somebody's shoulder and to care about folks. It has nothing to do with church, but it's something they learned, perhaps, at church. And so I believe that if we really want to listen to Jesus' message, what we need to do is figure out how, when we leave here, every single one of us, from the oldest of us to the youngest of us, finds a place to reach out and care for others. These blessing bags are one small way to serve. These blessing bags are a way to make a connection with someone and to give them something of value that puts you in relationship to where that need really is. The prayer shawls that are in front here are another way that people whom we may never know about, never meet, never even know their story, receive a shawl that has been knitted or crocheted by people who were actively praying that whoever receives this shawl might know of the love of God that's a part of it. Jesus had to teach his disciples over and over again. And I know for myself, I have to learn it over and over again. And that's why I'm wearing this stole, because My mother-in-law gave this to me years and years ago. It was hand-woven in Chimayo, New Mexico. I have a whole set, but they don't match our stuff. So I don't get to wear them in church very often. But I thought today, when the gospel and everything we're doing is about service, I would wear it maybe as a reminder to me. Now, I have to tell you, this is also stewardship time. So I'm suggesting that there is another way also to think about service. There is the idea of being a servant giver. And I don't mean this in any sense humorously. We are so often assaulted by consumerist understandings of everything. We even can think of being a church as paying a membership fee to be a part of it. My invitation is that we think even of our giving, which is incredibly necessary to support all the work that is done by people from this place and to make a place that you can go out and minister from. That is important, but I invite you to see it as a way of being a servant giver, not a consumer of God's blessing, but a servant with every single part of your being. Amen.